Here. That's 10 present.
We have a quorum. Please rise and join us in the Pledge of Allegiance, which will be led this afternoon by Alderman Barzak.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
We will move right to item D.
Mayor Devine,
Alderman Lysak.
I move for suspension of the rules for the council to act upon a resolution to approve a development agreement between the City of West Allis and developers West Quarter East LLC and West Quarter West LLC regarding South 70th Street Corridor Development Project to replace any prior agreements.
Second.
We have a motion and a second to suspend the rules. Are there any objections? All in favor?
Aye.
Is anyone opposed? Rules are suspended. Mr. Decker.
Thank you. Just want to make sure this is on. This is the topic we talked about on Wednesday night. After some discussions with the developer and between the council, I redrafted the agreement to reflect those changes. So everyone should have gotten one last night around 5:30. But what I did is I took the PowerPoint that I had at the Safety and Development Committee meeting and updated it to reflect the current status, as well as within the PowerPoint, we'll show you the changes that were made. So I'll get right into it. A lot of this information is going to be the same as what you saw before. So these are the parties. Properties involved remain the same. All of this information is still the same. The summary and preface are the same. Here's where it starts getting a little different. The March 31st date was pushed back a couple weeks, likely to reflect the timing of approvals, that they weren't happening as soon as previously anticipated, and so a couple extra weeks were delayed. That did not change any of the deadlines, though, so just the start date was pushed back. You'll also see right here, part of the agreement and negotiations that took place, all of the references to building the hotel and all the end deadlines were shortened by 2 years, excuse me. And so where it used to say 2023, now it's 2021. And also the finish date, the start date was 21, the finish date then is March 31st of 2022. And so those are all the back-end deadlines, even though, as I said before, the developer has a more aggressive timeline set forth for as a personal goal. The last bullet point on the left there, that was the developer having to withdraw or waive any right to object to vacating right-of-way. That was removed. And then the total amounts for the letter of credit and the cash deposit were added. So a $300,000 letter of credit and a $700,000 cash deposit are going to be the definition for the TIF guarantee collateral. Nothing changed with the city's duties. McKinley Park, a lot of changes occurred. This is probably the most substantive changes to the agreement from Tuesday. The, again, start date was pushed back a couple weeks, but more significantly, the agreement now calls for the developer to be able to develop the southern 3.5 acres of McKinley Park upon giving 6 months notice to the city. But once that notice is given, and after 6 months have passed, then the developer can proceed to build any type of vertical improvements they want in that area pursuant to the C3 zoning code. On the northern end, the 1.72 acre parcel that currently exists, that will be set aside as the park for McKinley Park right now. There's also a 6-month notice to terminate that lease, except it's a little unique in that the city has the sole discretion to determine whether a suitable replacement park of at least 3 acres is found within the same neighborhood. So that area would be occupied as a park with no end date or any type of expiration until the city council approves a 3-acre parcel in the same neighborhood to be used as a park and also acquires that parcel. So the city has to actually take title to a parcel it deems to be appropriate and suitable at its sole discretion before the northern 1.72 acres, which is essentially the northernmost softball or Little League field, can be developed. The other aspect of this agreement is, and if anyone has questions on the McKinley Park arrangements, feel free to ask those as well. But-
Cale, if I could right now?
Sure.
On that boundary area, I thought we were talking about, it must be within the neighborhood with, we were saying 75th was going to be the western boundary, because we weren't counting Copperwood as a replacement.
Copperwood, I think, is only about 1.3 acres, so it wouldn't qualify as a 3-acre parcel anyway.
Okay.
And no matter what, even if there is a 3-acre parcel that's somewhere in this neighborhood from 76th to 70th, it still would have to be at the discretion of the council to say that it's suitable as a replacement, even if it meets the other restrictions. There's no automatic approval. It's going to always have to be at the council's decision and discretion to approve that parcel.
Yeah, and that could be a 5-5 vote with a vote by the mayor.
Could be.
Yeah.
It'd be a majority vote by the council. The other part of this relates to TIF financing, and so I can get into this more later, but this is one of the changes that was not approved or consented to by city staff. The developer is the one who is asking for that, and so it is in this draft. The reason it was put in this draft is because I wanted to present the council with a version of the agreement that was approved from the developer's perspective, with the idea of there is now an option to say yes and end this without any further amendments. So I didn't want to leave blank lines anywhere. I didn't want to have the developer have to come and explain this and have not allow the council an opportunity to read what the developer wanted beforehand. That's why it's in there. And I'm sure that the developer can explain why he was looking for that provision, and I'm sure that city staff can explain why they are opposed to that position.
Mayor Devine?
Alderman May?
Cale, reading C2 of Article 1, this has to do with the park area. And what it says is that they can terminate the park lease with respect to the park area, that's the 1.72 acres, upon at least 6 months prior written notice to the city that they intend to redevelop that area. And it says, provided, however, that they shall not commence any development of the park area until the city has acquired the land deemed suitable to replace the park.
Correct.
Is that a situation where we'd basically be kicked off the land and it could sit there vacant until we find that 3 acres? It doesn't sound like the lease, it sounds like the lease would be up, they just couldn't do anything with it. The way I'm reading that, would we be kicked off the land?
That's not how I understood it. I can see how if you would read it that way, though, so I'll clarify that the lease itself would continue until, because if no development could happen, yes, the alternative would be, it would just be a vacant parcel that no one can occupy.
All right, thank you.
So I'll clarify that in the language, though.
All right, I'd like to make sure that lease does continue, so we do have a park.
Yes,
Until the
that,
3
that is my understanding of the intent of the parties, but I'll make sure that language is in there.
Okay, thank you.
Mayor Devine?
Alderman Weigel?
And Cale, on that topic also, so as I read it, there could be a period of time in which we've acquired this replacement park parcel, but have not completed, I mean, because building the park isn't gonna take long, I don't think. But, so there could be a period of time, like one summer season, when we have no neighborhood park?
There would be some lag time in there probably. So if a suitable park was found and title was granted to the city or passed on to the city in some manner, then at that point in time, development could start as long as a 6-month notice had elapsed. And so there might be some time in which the city needs to either take down buildings or make improvements to convert that acreage into a park. So if the timing, at worst case scenario, the timing could result in a slight delay where there's no neighborhood park for a temporary time.
I guess my concern is we're not talking about any specific parcel here right now, but usually some sort of phase 1 assessment would be done on I mean, it could be a parcel that's contaminated as a brownfield, which could, my concern is that not only is it potentially the time it takes us to build a park from an empty lot, but what if we find out that the ground underneath is not suitable for us to put a park on?
The proper way to do that would be to do all the examinations environmentally before acquiring it. And so if they're not gonna, if the owner, whoever that is, does not allow the city to do at least a phase 1, potentially a phase 2 environmental study of their parcel, my advice would be to not pursue that parcel. Which a phase 2 is just looking at the records related to the park. Phase 2 is actual destructive testing
Yeah,
of the land.
yeah.
So I would recommend that unless the owner consents to the city doing the testing prior to acquiring title, to not pursue that parcel.
Right.
Because of that very reason.
And that would be normal due diligence on this thing.
Yes, that would be the standard way that most real estate deals go.
Okay, thank you. But as I said, there still could be a season, probably a summer season, where we don't have a park. There'd be a coming soon sign on the parcel, and there could be bulldozers working on McKinley.
That is possible. You'd want to, obviously, foreseeing that as being a possibility, do everything the city can to avoid that. So having the transaction occur at a time in which the city can immediately start building
Yeah,
would be very appropriate.
and have the planning.
Have the planning
and
ready to
everything
go, and so when the title actually transfers, everyone's ready to roll as quickly as possible. That's a timing decision, and something the council could do in relation to when it's determined to be a suitable parcel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Regarding the tax increment financing, one of the provisions that was added on Tuesday as a result of negotiations was the fact that any increment generated between $18.9 and $21.1 million for the total project, except for the school buildings, including the school buildings, the entire project, if it's between that value, any increment paid would go toward the cost of the park replacement parcel and any improvements to be made. So given the tax rate right now, it's a little north of $60,000 per year that would be put into there, and it would vary depending on the tax rate. But that amount of money would be earmarked solely for the park replacement parcel costs and the park improvements. Most of this information did not change, other than the fact that the overall assessed value guarantee did go up to $21.1 million from the $18.9 that it could have been at. The letter of credit also, given the form that was submitted, it's now a $300,000 letter of credit that must be renewed annually. The repurchase rights, which we were discussing before, that default, which was scheduled to occur on the that timeline, was 2023. It's now 2021 because everything moved back 2 years, or moved up, 2 years, for the completion of phase 1. But one of the remedies was this idea of the city repurchasing all property for $1, paying off liens. One of the provisions that was added to ensure the viability of the project was that if any parcels within the project are sold, or if a loan is issued for vertical development, meaning improvements on one of the parcels, and a construction loan is issued, then that parcel, and only that parcel that's affected, will be released from this particular provision. And that just ensures that development can continue on this land without this being an impediment in title, because this is going to be recorded against the property, and so any subsequent purchase would be responsible for this if it's not released. If there's any questions on that, I can answer those as well, either now or later. Miscellaneous provisions remain the same. So from the version that was sent out on Tuesday, here are the major substantive changes that occurred since then. Deadline's moving up 2 years. The changes to the McKinley Park arrangement, which I went into, and I'm happy to answer more questions on if anyone would like to. The developer does not waive the objection to vacation of the road. The TIF guarantee collateral has been set, and the repurchase rights were adjusted so that the sale or certain financing arrangements would automatically result in that particular parcel affected being released from the repurchase rights. The yet to be resolved issue is the idea of the 90% payment from all increment generated. Now, essentially, the top one there, one of the provisions that was not approved by staff but was inserted at the request of the developer was the idea of splitting the payments that come in from development of the park area, I believe is how it was phrased. Was it the park area or was it the rest of the park? This one may be the park area. I have to double check on that one just to make sure, but nonetheless, it's a 50-50 split from anything that's coming out of the $18.9 to $21.1 million that is supposed to be earmarked for park replacement and park improvements. That money would be split 50-50, so half of it goes toward the replacement park, half goes towards park improvements. The wording before the developer proposed that had it to be split and was at a rate to be determined. So the parties have to come to an agreement on how it's supposed to be split and divvied up at that point. And no interest, or at least the current interest rate, would be paid as opposed to a standard 6%. And so what that really means is the developer would be receiving a 6% annual rate of return under the terms proposed by the developer, and the city would just accept whatever the rate is going to be at the time that this would happen. The theory is that if it's less than 6%, the developer would have an advantage to be getting a higher rate than what the market would normally bear. And if the rate is higher than that, then the city could stick to 6% and get a deal that the market wouldn't normally allow. So it's not as much money involved in that one. It's not as significant, but it's still important to make sure enough cash is there to pay for the improvements and pay for the park. And so that's just one issue that was yet to be resolved. The second one is actually probably the most significant one that the council should pay attention to. This has to do with increment above $21.1 million in overall assessed value. Right now, the agreement shows 90% of all that increment generated, all the payments coming in, would go to the developer to develop within this TIF district. Prior to that, the rate was to be determined once a project was presented. So it just simply said before a percentage of the TIF. So if a project is $41.1 million, let's say the assessed value after 1 year or after a certain year is $41.1 million, that'd leave $20 million of excess or increased value in assessed value. Whatever the tax rate is and payments coming in on that $20 million, 90% of that would go to the developer for activities within. Otherwise, right now there is no rate actually set. And so the parties would negotiate how much of that goes to the developer based on what the developer is going to do with that money. So again, as presented, it says 90%, and that's the hard number. If the council is looking to change that to a different hard number, that's an option. If the council wants to go back to just simply saying a percentage and leaving it up to negotiations on a later date, that is also an option. So there could also be a minimum or maximum or a range. There's a lot of different options on how the council wants to deal with it. Because that is a negotiation point, I'd recommend going into closed session to discuss the options there if the council is interested in doing so. The final one is how much increment from developing parcel A. This is a little more obscure one, but if it gets to the point where the city has found a replacement park, has acquired that title, and development is authorized for that northern 1.72 acres of McKinley Park, the development that occurs on that parcel, 90% of that excess increment that is generated would go to the developer under the terms of the current version. That was a term also, and that provision was also put in by the developer. It was not put in by city staff. And so, and on top of that, there'd also be a 6% rate on that amount for those increment bonds. The city staff one had just simply saying, again, a percentage to be negotiated later, depending on the project that is presented, and also had whatever interest rate was current at that time would be paid, as opposed to fixing it at 6%. So this is the last slide I have, and it really is, I think, the only major issue that remains to be resolved. And so, as I said, if you want to discuss the options of this one, I think it's important to go into closed session because it does involve negotiations for what could be a lot of money in the future for the city and within this district as well. But other than that, I'll stand for questions.
Thank you for the presentation. Are there any additional questions from the council?
Mayor Devine,
Alderman May.
I'd move we go into closed session.
Second.
Alderman May, we have to read the notice.
Of course.
The committee may convene in closed session pursuant to the provisions of Wisconsin State Statute 19.85 sub 1 sub E for the purpose of deliberating or negotiating the purchase of public properties or the investing of public funds. The committee may reconvene in open session after completion of the closed session to consider the balance of the agenda.
My motion remains the same. Go into closed session.
Second.
We have a motion, we have a second. For the sake of discussion, the developer had asked if he could speak to us before because he won't be in the room during closed session. Is there objection to that?
No objection.
Before we vote then, you're, I believe, essentially speaking on the motion, but go ahead.
Great, thank you. Scott Yauk with Cobalt Partners. Good afternoon. Thanks for coming out during the soon-to-be Marquette game, I think, and for your time the other night. It was a late night, I know, for everybody. Again, with respect to all the changes up there, we're in agreement and concurrence with the draft. The item that's open is that 90% item, and just want to talk a little bit about, you know, where that shows up in the agreement. It's on page, I think it's page 7. I don't know which draft. It's under Article 2, sub D, but this is really the MRO, and this relates to the second phase. And the reason it's important to us is leaving unspecified what that amount might be. It could be 10%, it could be 90%. We've worked in other communities. In Greenfield, there was TIF for the parking structure, and it was 100% of any revenue generated above a base. In that case, the first 20 million of tax base on that parcel went to the city. Anything above it funded the parking structure. There are other protections in the agreement that relate to the MRO, and that's kind of what pointed to the lower part of that paragraph. But if we come in with a development, and again, that's sort of the premise here, is phase 2 is really what this is about, a lot of the vertical development. So we have to support or provide a pro forma and analysis with supporting information. One, documenting the gaps. There's got to be a financing gap. This isn't automatically paid out at 90%. There's got to be a gap established under, you know, the TIF rules, under the but-for test. 2, there's a full underwriting to be performed by the city or its consultants and advisors. 3, the IRR on the project can't exceed 16%. The total assistance can't be more than 25% of the development. So if we bring in a $40 million development that's capped at $10 million, and we've got to justify the need for the $10 million. And then there's a limitation on the developer fee, can't exceed 5%. The nature of the project has to be commercial, it can't be residential. So there's a number of safeguards. The concern becomes, one, lenders looking at the project today, they're financing a significant amount on land that they expect to see developed, and that's the way they get repaid for that financing. Leaving that to future negotiation then becomes problematic. Again, in communities we've been at 100%, we've been at 85%. You know, we're certainly willing to do something less than 90 if there's some comfort, but it isn't automatic. This isn't a situation where you're pre-agreeing to that, but it gives us some comfort that if we're going after, say, an office development that's going to be, you know, $30, $40 million, that there's the ability to when we're working with that user up front to, you know kind of what we're dealing with, as opposed to coming back through a process that sometimes doesn't let us respond to the marketplace as quickly as we'd like to. And it's really contemplated to relate to things like parking structure. So, you know, there's a need for that. So I would ask you to consider that, and if there's a number, you know, 80%, I mean, we'd live with that. Again, this is a negotiation about dollars that don't exist. This isn't a situation we're saying, you know, will the city go out and subsidize with existing dollars or borrow money? This is not borrowed money. It's kind of under the eat what you kill concept. So this is a situation where there is no development today. If we bring 40 million, and the only reason we could bring that 40 million is because of the assistance, then as those dollars come in, it's a portion that's committed to going to the project, the balance is going to the city. So there isn't a lot of risk. I think that, you know, 10% typically covers, you know, any of the cost of administration as well as some cushion for the city. So I just want to make sure everyone understands kind of what the context is and why it's important to us. So if there's any questions, I can address them.
Thank you. Are there any questions on Mr. Yauk's comments?
Mayor Devine,
Alderman May.
if it's acceptable. If not, as a parliamentarian, tell me to shut up, please. With the park, the way I read this is that under Article 1, C2, the way I had read this is that the park lease, you give us 6 months' notice to kick us out, but you can't develop it until we have a 3-acre piece of land.
Sure.
And what I'd like to do is have that strengthened to say that the lease will, you know, also is contingent upon having that 3 acres of land.
Yeah, and that's the
Is that-
intention.
is
I was
that
going to get up
agreeable?
before. Yeah, absolutely. I was going to get
Okay.
up before, but didn't want to get out of line. But yeah, that was the intention, so we can adjust that. We agree.
Any other questions from the council?
Great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We do have a motion before us to go into closed session. Is there any other discussion on that motion? Seeing none, Mr. Clerk, please call the roll.
Alderman Barzak.
Aye.
Schlesky.
Aye.
Oidenayer.
Aye.
Haas.
Aye.
Lysick.
Aye.
May.
Aye.
Frankie.
Aye.
Rope. Vitale.
Aye.
Weigel.
Aye.
That's 10 yeses.
We are in closed session. We'll give everybody a minute or two to leave. Escape.